Right. Well, Alan Jones, thanks very much for joining us for a chat this afternoon for Keep Cardiff Live. As you know, and also, by the way, I enjoyed the setting up for this meeting. It's possibly the best bit. We'll see. I really enjoyed it. I loved your book, as you know, and really, it's one of the most enjoyable books I've ever read. I'll just explain why, which I think you'll get. Is
Okay.
What I really like about your book, in terms of the kind of just the pure layout, apart from anything else. Never mind the great stories and the insight into music. I love the idea myself. It's might be my mind and whatever. Maybe I'm lazy. I love just reading a few pages just before I go to sleep. I love it like that kind of book, and it's a great
Yeah.
story. Bang, lovely. Another one tomorrow. It just works really well for me. And I suppose it's kind of in that way it works like a music magazine, I suppose. I mean, obviously that's where the format sort of comes from, but
Yes.
that's the attraction. Were you conscious of that kind of thing when you put the book together? Did you consider other ways of doing it?
Well, the book was based on a long-running column, back page column feature that I wrote for Uncut magazine, and that drew on my experiences when I worked on Melody Maker, principally in the 70s. I started at Melody Maker in 74, and the book sort of is drawn from a lot of interviews on the road stories that I wrote, going up until about the mid-80s when I became editor of Melody Maker, and I wrote a lot less, unfortunately, because my time was otherwise preoccupied. So they were condensed versions, and they were very, very popular. And I found that when I went back to the original articles that the columns were based on, it was sometimes a bit overwritten, and I could, cut to, what was really essential to make a really amusing story, or hopefully a bit enlightening, or show some insight into the character I was writing about.
Yeah.
And it seemed just more accessible. I could cover more ground by making the stories as concise as possible. Some I expanded from the original pages in Uncut, and did a lot more work and added a lot of new material. But
Yeah.
the aim throughout was to keep it to be very, very kind of short with the pieces, to pack more in, and to
Yes.
give us more of a mosaic of what the time was like.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
The music business was a very, very different world in the
yeah.
70s and 80s
Yeah.
than to what it's like now.
I mean, we're talking about "Can't Stand Up for Falling Down," by the way, which we haven't mentioned the book. But obviously, we'll put that into the text. So, 45 years ago, you started. Nearly 46 years ago, you started
Yeah,
at the Melody Maker. Wow.
that's right.
So, I mean, that's a difficult question to answer, really briefly. But you say how things have changed since then. Do you want to summarize how music has changed from your perspective in that time, more or
Well,
less?
there was a weekly music press for a start, which doesn't exist anymore.
Hmm.
It was in the pre-internet days. Um, it wasn't at the time that I started reading the music press any access to information about bands. The bands that the music weeklies were writing about invariably weren't played on the radio. It was pre-Radio One even. Um,
Yeah.
and there was a wildness about the music industries in those days. And the excess is legendary.
Hmm.
And, whatever stories anybody's read about the excess of the music business in the 70s and to a certain extent into the 80s
Yeah.
is well merited.
Yeah.
There are very few exaggerations about the kind of wildness that went on. And you had, crucially, a lot more access to artists. I mean, I could go on the road for a week with the Clash. There'd be no press officer. I would be with the band,
Hmm.
all the time. There weren't any barriers. You were just sharing the experience with the groups you were on the road with, and even in more formal interviews. Latterly, there's been a great deal of control exerted by record companies, management, PR companies,
Yeah.
and your access to an artist is limited. You're lucky if you get 45 minutes with somebody, which is no time at all. Of course, if you're on the road with the band and there's no press officer, you've got constant access to them. You're part of the touring entourage. You work your way into the inner circle, and you get your story. And it was very rare when I first started, for instance, to be told that you're interviewing, kind of a major figure for a cover story on Melody Maker. There was no time limit. you just went in and, you let the interview run its course, and, there were very few constraints. Um, Latterly, you try to get access to people, and it's virtually impossible, and you don't get them in unguarded moments at all. And of course, what also has to be remembered is the incredible influence and power of the music press in those days,
I was going to
which
ask you.
diminished completely over the years.
I mean, just to put it into context, I mean, obviously, I work in a university, so I'm dealing with sort of 18 to 21-year-olds all the time, I mean, but they don't even know there was a music press. I mean, how big was, a paper like Melody Maker? How significant was it in terms of a kind of a communication tool for people who wanted to find out what was happening in music?
Well, basically, it was Melody Maker, principally for me, as my music weekly of choice, was incredibly important. That's where I read reviews of the new bands whose music I got into, even just as some things like tour dates. Basically, there was no other source of the kind of information or entertainment. You just couldn't hear or find anything out about these bands apart from the music weeklies. And the sales reflected their significance. When I joined Melody Maker, I think he was selling 250,000 copies a week.
Wow.
NME was selling, at the time I joined, a little less, but was on a powerful sort of commercial upswing. And it overtook Melody Maker eventually. But there were also magazines like Sounds, Record Mirror, Disc. So that weekly music paper scene was huge. The advertising revenues alone were fantastic, which kept the publishers happy, and every issue sold massively.
Yeah.
I think it shaped the tastes of a lot of teenagers like myself. The music weekly.
Yeah, I mean, I know you. Is it Port Talbot you're originally from? Or
yes.
Near Port Talbot. So you.
I'm in Port Talbot.
So when you were growing up as a young man in that kind of neck of the woods, you'd be nipping down the newsagents once a week and buying these papers, and I'm guessing you started to kind of pick up on your favorite writers, and then it must have been
very much so.
Yeah, who were your favorite writers at the time? Do you remember?
On Melody Maker, which became first of all, when I became besotted by music, I had, I think, all 4 of the music weeklies delivered every Thursday, and Melody Maker very quickly became the paper that I liked most. It was my favourite, and among the writers there, the most obvious one was a writer named Chris Welsh. He seemed to basically typify and embody Melody Maker. He was one of the first writers I remember that had his own picture byline. He wasn't particularly a favourite of mine, but I thought he dictated a lot of Melody Maker's content. He was a great champion of prog rock, for instance, which was not a music I particularly liked. But he hung out with all the major prog bands. So for any fan of prog music, you went to Melody Maker and you read Chris Welsh. You didn't go anywhere else. My favourite writers, however, were Richard Williams, who's gone on to have a long and distinguished career, and was editor of Melody Maker briefly in 1979, 1980. He was a fantastic writer in terms of the bands that he turned me on to, and some bands who I'd already discovered for myself. I would read about them in Melody Maker, and if Richard had written about them and given them the seal of approval, it would kind of reassure me that I wasn't totally mad. And listening to the Velvet Underground in 1967 was kind of a unique experience, and none of my friends were particularly into them.
How were you listening to them?
But Richard championed them, so that was great.
Yeah. I mean, I love that, because obviously, John Peel famously introduced people to new music that they wouldn't otherwise have heard. I suppose these days you could argue maybe Radio 6 is about the closest to that at the moment, I suppose, in terms of like radio station kind of stuff. And people get their stuff these days through, social media, online things.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it's not that, it's the other way in which is so massively changed, of course, is the kind of physicality of content. I mean, I remember, you know, buying music magazines. Some of them were a fair old read, by the way. It'd take you a couple of days to work your way through them. And, you know, by the time you look through all the kind of, all the bits and bobs and the reviews and the interviews and everything else. And, you know, but I like the idea of picking up a music paper, and it's kind of got a smell and it's got a texture and it's in your hands. And then you go to a record shop and you buy a record, you know, and you look at the cover. You know,
Yeah,
well,
we'd have a gatefold sleeve.
yeah. I mean, it's just all gone, isn't it? Really, pretty
Yes.
well. You know, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're dealing in almost sort of abstracts these days, you know, but, you know, the routine of, you know, getting the Melody Maker every Thursday was something to, you know, the whole week seemed to be based around that sometimes, you know, you're counting down from one issue to the next, and it was always ready for it to arrive. And, you know, I used to read it from cover to cover,
Yeah.
from the news pages right through to the Loon Pants ads.
Yes. So you're a proper devotee of it.
Oh,
Which is
totally. I
nice,
was
yeah.
absolutely immersed in Melody Maker. You know, you know, as my interest in music intensified, really, it became more and more valuable. I must say that I'd never had any ambition or intention to end up writing for it.
No,
That
and
was
as you
that was a
say,
career move I couldn't have
yeah.
predicted.
So, I mean, we were talking about that because it's a great story. I know you've said it many times before, but you talk about it in the book. But so what was it? You know, I'll ask you about it in a second. How old were you when you started reading the Melody Maker? Were you a teenager?
I would have been about 14.
Right. Okay. And what was the music scene in your kind of, you know, neck of the woods in those days? What was I imagine Port Talbot was you know, was ringing out with great music.
There were a couple of local bands. I think the most the band Man were from Swansea,
Okay.
basically,
Yeah.
around the valleys.
Yeah.
They were probably the best known Welsh group, and at least one of their members in a fairly early lineup was somebody I'd known at school, a keyboards player called Phil Ryan. I don't remember actually seeing that. I think I saw them in an earlier kind of incarnation as a group called the Sabres. But it wasn't really a music scene that I was too aware of. There was a club in a place near Swansea called Skewin, the Ritz there, and they had quite a few bands on that I seem to remember going to see. And there was a fantastic club in Bridgend called the Key Club. And through 68, 69, I went there a lot. It seemed that anybody who was signed to Harvest Records was contractually obliged to play there. So we used to see Roy Harper there, the Edgar Broughton Band, Third Ear Band, Pete Brown's group, Kevin Ayres, Pink Floyd played there twice. And it was a tiny, tiny place, probably not much larger than the room you're sitting in now.
Wow.
But really, it was all records.
Yeah.
And, you know, ready, steady, go. So, you know, the first bands I was into were the Stones, the Small Faces, the Who, the Kinks, Stones.
Where do you get that love of music from? Is it from your parents or?
Not especially. We had a record player and some old 78s, but my dad had a certain fondness for country music, but they weren't avid music fans by any means. I just kind of picked up on it because it was something happening. I think we were on holiday in a Butlins holiday camp, and I remember I think it was probably something by the Stones was playing. I can't remember what it was. One of the early singles, and you know, I just was just captivated by it. And I remember going home from that holidays and, you know, asking my mother if she could cancel all the other kind of magazines and sort of comics and whatever I took, and so I could have the music weeklies delivered. And after that, it was just an increasingly fervor for music. You know, seeking out stuff that excited me. And, you know, at that time, you know, every new record that came out seemed to be groundbreaking or mind-blowing in one way or another. When you think of all the bands, you know, the five that I've just mentioned, but then 67 came along and you had Jimi Hendrix, you had the Pink Floyd, the Velvet Underground, Love. I mean, it was just an amazing time.
Yeah. And as you say, so very different to now. I mean, I was just thinking years ago, I played in bands for kind of like unsuccessfully for about 40 years. I had a couple of really minor deals with tiny little labels, but I remember I went to London to promote some stuff years ago, probably in the 80s, late 80s, I reckon, or maybe early 90s. And I mean, the A&R guy pretty well, you know, this is how the conversation went. He said, oh, you're from Wales, are you? Or, you know, all right, yeah. Oh, you know, I quite like your stuff, and no, I don't really. And then he went on to really rip it out of us, and said, and he said, you know, to take the mick out of me totally for even having the audacity to be Welsh and to enter a record label to try and get a record deal. Basically, laughed me out of the building, you know.
Really?
Yeah. So I mean, I wonder what the perception is for you. I know if I ask you to tell that story about how you got into journalism, there's quite an amazing story, really. You know, how you were received as this young lad from, you know, sort of, Port Talbot area in Wales. You know, how'd you have the cheek to turn up an interview?
I don't think my nationality or background was an issue. What concerned the senior editors at Melody Maker when I turned up was the fact that they knew very little about me, apart from the fact that I had no training in journalism whatsoever. I'd been interviewed by the job by Ray Coleman, who was the editor, and it was very peculiar. I wrote a letter of application when my girlfriend saw the ad for a vacancy at Melody Maker, but they never asked me for any evidence of the fact that I could actually write. I'd written a very long letter of application. I imagined when people around the country, saw that advert, a lot of people who worked for local papers, who had been through NUJ training, NUJ school, journalist school, formal training on local papers, and covered the usual local newspaper beat of, weddings, floral arrangements at the town hall, funerals, the occasional murder on a council estate. They knew all the professional veracities of journalism. I had none. I just left art school, and it ended up, I moved to London, and I'd been working in the mail order department of a bookshop when the ad was brought to my attention. Ray Coleman just interviewed me. I had no evidence. I had no pre-written reviews. I didn't think to write them a sample review of a favourite album or an album that I didn't like. So I just turned up, and I hadn't met anybody else on the staff. And I remember Mick Watts, who was the assistant editor and another writer who I greatly admired. He was frankly shocked that I'd got the job. He thought I must have, kind of mesmerised Ray, or, cast him under some kind of spell, or, kind of used some suave, seductive technique to, brainwash him into offering me a position that, as far as Mick was concerned, I probably didn't deserve. And there were likely to be a lot more suitable candidates that Ray had turned down, who had, as I say, gone through the whole NUJ training, experience on local papers, which in fact is where most of the writers that I joined on Melody Maker, including Mick, I come from. They'd all worked on provincial papers. They all had a sound journalistic background. I was seen as somebody who just come along out of nowhere with my glam rock shoulder pads and long hair and bracelets. And I kind of didn't fit into the office for several reasons. But the big concern wasn't where I'd come from, or that Wales was some kind of hillbilly backwater. It was because they weren't convinced that I was up for the job.
I mean, I'm trying to think of your book. I seem to remember. I remember you put the letter in the book. I think it was like a really, really cheeky, really cheeky letter that you put.
Oh, well, when it came to the end, I in the letter, because I didn't have any examples of writing to send to them, and it never occurred to me to actually write something that I could send them to show that I could put, a few words together in a coherent sentence. I just described my background. I explained that I'd, grown up reading the Melody Maker, how influential it had been in shaping my musical tastes. I went through all the writers that I really liked, the couple that I wasn't too keen on. I thought I should take a sort of, I thought everybody applying for the job would be incredibly effusive about Melody Maker. And I thought to stand out, it might be an opportunity to be a little more critical. I think this is a bit of my art school background coming in as well, to be a little confrontational about the application. And I did make clear that over the last sort of 6 months to a year, I've been buying NME a little more often because that they really revived and renewed themselves when it looked like they were going to close because of falling sales. They took a brave chance on employing people like Charles Shaw Murray and Nick Kent from the underground press. So they didn't have the same sort of journalistic training. And I ended up building up a bit of a head of steam, really, in my criticism of Melody Maker, and then got to the end of it, and I thought, well, I can barely say, thank you for your attention, I look forward to hearing from you. That seemed a bit weak. So as a bit of a sign-off, I thought about it for a while and came up with what I thought would be a line that would attract somebody's attention. So I just said that Melody Maker needs a bullet up the arse, I'm the gun, pull the trigger.
Yes.
And
yes,
the line just came to me, and I wrote it down. I thought, I'll get this in an envelope and send it off before, I have second thoughts about it. And it might have seemed incredibly arrogant, but it was an arrogance based on nothing but, bravado.
I suppose you didn't think you'd get it, though,
did
did you?
get Ray Coleman's attention, and I did get the interview as a result of that.
Yeah, it worked. It could easily have not worked. I imagined that you put that in there because you thought, well, to hell with it. If I get it, I'm never going to get this anyway, so I might as well shoot from the hip.
Oh, well, absolutely. By then, I had to be persuaded over a week or so to even apply for the job. As I said, my girlfriend Kathy had seen the ad, and she knew I wasn't especially happy working in the mail order department of the bookstore. And she said, this sounds like you, exactly, because they said they were looking for somebody who was under 21, which I was at the time, and who was passionate about music and had a lot of opinions about music. I had a lot of records and as many opinions about what I was listening to, and I was always sounding off to whoever would listen about what I thought about this band or that band. And also, crucially, in that initial ad, they said that no previous journalistic experience was necessary. So they were obviously trying to reach out to somebody a little different. At least this is what I hope.
Yeah. Maybe I suppose that they were kind of consciously trying to go for a younger audience. I guess and that was the idea.
Well, I think they must have somebody, possibly Mick Watts, who was the assistant editor I mentioned, may possibly have seen that writers like Nick and Charlie at NME and Ian MacDonald, Tony Tyler, were writing in a different way, a fresher way. I mean, my biggest criticism of Melody Maker at the time was that he was so incredibly conservative and very predictable. It wasn't terribly excitingly written. It needed some kind of different voice, I thought. It was all, very professionally written, but one thing that always staggered me was the absence of humor. Which that's vital.
Which I can safely say you inserted with some style.
Well, that came just very naturally to me.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't go into Melody Maker with any kind of set agenda. The first thing I wanted to do was as much work as possible, just to learn, the simple craft of writing.
Yeah, I mean, what was it like when you? There's so many. Just to say for anyone, the book is just full of absolutely fantastic stories. If you love music, it's really it's just I think it's a great read, and I was so chuffed actually that I managed to get hold of Allan to do the interview. Tony Chapman has joined us below from Keep Cardiff Live. The main reason, can you see it? You can see everybody, Tony, can you? Yeah. So I'm chatting to Allan now, and you're welcome to sit in on it. Obviously, it's your thing anyway. We're talking about these early days at the Melody Maker, but I've asked, this is almost going back to the old days with Allan when you were out there doing your original interviews, and maybe you'd run out of tape or whatever. But in this case, with the Zoom recording, so I don't know if we can capture some of this, or I give you rights, or however it works, just to make sure I don't lose any of this stuff. I am recording at the moment, but it's like time limited, Allan, so I don't want to run out of time on it.
No, my time is not limited.
But Zoom initially gives you 40 minutes, but I know Tony has a pro account, so we should be okay. That's a good hat you got on there today, Tom, by the way. Very, very cool. You're looking. Well done. Very suave.
It's because I've not done my hair, so.
So you're going to have a look around in the background, Tom. Thanks for that. Allan, I imagine, well, two things for it really. I was going to ask you, what was it like when you, because I remember when I worked in radio for a few years, right? I got sacked from loads of places, but I did get, that's where I worked. And I remember I got a big love of sport. I'm a Cardiff City supporter, and I listened to Red Dragon radio at that time. And there was a guy called Phil Suarez, who was the football commentator for my football club, and I absolutely loved listening to him. And then I remember the first time I met him, oh my God, it's Phil Suarez, And I got to meet him, and I got to know him, became very good friends. Passed away a few years ago, sadly, but I became very good friends with him. What was it like for you when you met those guys you've been reading all that time? Was that a bit mind-blowing for you?
Totally mind-blowing. I mean, I was a fan, who was given this amazing opportunity to write for Melody Maker, and as a result, meet people who, from time I was about 14 or 15, have been my absolute heroes, and it was just such an exciting opportunity to walk into a room and meet Lou Reed or David Bowie.
Wow, yeah.
It was. I constantly, every day, just couldn't. I'd be walking. When I first joined Melody Maker, their offices were in Fleet Street, which added a greater sense of glamour to the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I remember I'd be walking down Fleet Street towards the Melody Maker office, and for years, I couldn't believe that I'd been so lucky to get that job.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just unbelievable. And
yeah.
It was a while before I met anybody who was really, somebody I'd been desperate to meet. The first assignments I got were, basically the jobs that nobody else was keen on doing. It was a lot, chart acts, Shawaddy Waddy, Gary Glitter, the Bay City Rollers. But it was good fun. I did Mud. And they were obviously used to people, going along and, asking, what's the new single? Are you going to tour? What do you think of, a record that's in the charts by one of your rivals, hoping they'd say something was mildly controversial. But I went along and just chatted to them. I sensed that they had a history. And of course, you start talking about, their early days touring Germany, playing Hamburg or whatever that. And you just get these fantastic anecdotes. Everybody's got these brilliant stories.
Yes.
Most of the time they're never asked about it, especially those kind of groups, because nobody took them particularly seriously as musicians.
I mean,
I just grooved on it.
Gary Glitter springs to mind as an example. Sorry, Allan. Just to say, Gary Glitter immediately springs to mind. When you first met Gary Glitter, without going into kind of things which happened later on in his career, shall we say. I mean, what was that like as an experience? Well,
I remember we were. I think he was at the BBC, and they only had this really little. It was like a store cupboard that we had to sit in. I was virtually sitting in his lap. He was so tiny. I must say, there was no foreshadowing of the darkness to come. I mean, he was actually quite funny. I mean, it's chilling to think of what happened in the future, but I didn't get any kind of inkling at the time.
No.
He was just another job on a very long tick list of things to do that week at the time.
When I was you said you started, we said about you being a 14-year-old. I seem to remember when I was 14, I think I'm right in saying my favorite record at the time was Rock and Roll Part 1. So, I'm as guilty as anyone else. Did you have any kind of, I wonder if you ever did this, did you ever have like a conscious interviewing style, or were you just inquisitive and it naturally happened?
From the very, very start, I would do as much preparatory work as possible. Every interview that I ever did, unless it was something, completely on the hoof, I I would actually prepare a list of questions, which I hope then would, as I developed hopefully as a writer, I then found that if I could structure the questions in a certain way, it would take me and the person I was interviewing where I wanted them to go. And it would also help in the structure of the piece that I eventually wrote.
Yes.
Because deadlines in those days were ferocious. Melody Maker really worked just like galley slaves. You did umpteen interviews a week, record reviews, live reviews. You ended up, writing up tour news or whatever. So anything you could do to help speed along the process was very helpful. But as I say, I always treated the interviews kind of quite formally in a way. I would have a list of questions, and I soon learned that the list of questions is only the starting point. The
Yes.
most important questions aren't the ones on the list in front of you. They're your follow-up questions.
Yeah.
So, what I learned, I think, very quickly is that listening to the answers was more important than actually asking the question.
Yes.
Because you didn't know where that would take you. Always follow up on the question you just asked.
I mean, I noticed with some of the articles, sometimes the article is about the experience of the interview rather than the interview itself. You just follow that tangent, don't you? It goes where it goes, which I really like,
Well, yeah, sometimes I would introduce that aspect to the stories if I thought it was illuminating about the way the kind of music business worked, or if there was something unique to that artist in the way they'd set up the interview.
Yeah.
Sometimes they were just hilarious stories, sometimes funnier than the actual interviews themselves.
Yes.
But I thought every aspect of the experience was worth noting in some way. I always saw myself as a conduit between the reader and the artist, and to make that experience of me meeting the artist, on behalf of the reader and fans like myself who would have loved to have been in that position, just to try to make it as vivid as possible. So if sometimes that included, extraneous things or things that didn't seem immediately relevant, I would see if I could make them so.
Well, and you are very descriptive. I mean, I mean, obviously you're a very successful writer, but I love your writing style. Vivid is the word that springs to mind, and also very observational, things that are happening, which are reasonably kind of mundane sometimes, are quite arguably inconsequential, but they become part of the story. And I think you're very, very observant in that way.
Yeah, well, I think part of that, again, is an art school background. I think very visually, so I observe visually. And there's an American writer I love. He's a thriller crime writer by reputation, named Elmore Leonard. And I got that off him. His novel, he's the best descriptive writer I've ever read. And it's not because he's dense with his description. Just 2 or 3 sentences, well-observed detail. Just tells you volumes about a character. So I tried quite consciously to emulate that, to describe, a room, what was in it. Just to add to the atmosphere, the color, the sense of location, the proximity. I became quite besotted with that idea of, building that kind of detailed picture.
Yeah.
So so it was a tangible setting. It used to drive me up the wall that when I used to read stuff in Melody Maker, I had no idea where the interviews had taken place.
Yeah.
There might be a fleeting reference to, being in a pub or something, but otherwise, all these interviews could have been done over the phone or rewritten from a press release. There was no sense of having met somebody or learning about that person from the pieces that I used to write, to read.
And of course, of great joy to yourself, you ended up, because interviewing that writer, didn't you?
Interviewing?
The chapter you mentioned there.
Elmore Leonard. Yeah, sorry.
Which is lovely when that happens, isn't it?
Was, I think I was editor of Melody Maker by then, and we'd always had, or for the last couple of years before I became editor, a page where we might do brief interviews with a filmmaker if there was a music documentary out, really. But I kind of expanded that to incorporate a bit more of film reviews, interviews with directors, and occasionally when the opportunity came up with authors. And Elmore Leonard had a book out. I somehow heard that he was in town doing interviews, and managed to get an interview with him.
Was that one of
the section of Melody Maker that I'm talking about, actually, I should mention, was almost like a blueprint for what Uncut became.
Yeah, I mean, we'll come on to Uncut. I also loved Uncut. Was Uncut one of the first ones to have the free CD on the front? Was that your idea?
Melody Maker had a couple of CDs. We were the first of the music monthlies to do that regularly.
Yeah.
It started off, as you can imagine, as a promotional boost. Put on a free CD, and you hope that because you're giving away a free CD, sales will go up. Unfortunately, the first couple of CDs that Melody Uncut did to achieve that purpose failed dismally. We had a chap who compiled the CDs for the for NME, Melody Maker, and then Uncut, and then Vox Magazine, and also tapes. A guy called Roy Carr, who famously compiled the NME C81 tapes, and their award-winning tapes and charity albums. And basically, he could be a bit of a barrow boy. And the first two CDs that he compiled for Uncut were classic movie theme tunes recorded by the Bulgarian Symphony Orchestra. So they were pretty awful. And we used to play them in the office just for a laugh, but I don't think anybody who bought the magazine especially enjoyed them. No. And then we had an opportunity to do another free CD. And I thought, we don't want, the Dam Busters March or the Great Escape or the, Magnificent Seven theme tunes again. And I thought, well, what have we got in the issue? And I'd just written a cover story on Neil Young about the Doom trilogy, On the Beach, Nights Tonight. And I thought, maybe tie something in. And I went through the list of what we had planned for the issue, and it was all very American-based. We had a piece on the DVD debut of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There was an interview with Bret Easton Ellis, a couple of other things. And around that time, I'd started reviewing and listening to a lot of what was then alt country, but became Americana. And, there had been a lot of recent releases by people like Lamb Chop, Ryan Adams, Calexico, Hazel Dean, there were loads on there. And I thought, well, maybe we could put a CD that presents this as a new kind of music. It will certainly be new to a lot of people, but it does have, kind of reference, back to people like Grant Parsons, Willie Nelson, Johnny Cash, whatever. And I kind of made a list very quickly for what was out there. They took it to the publishers and they said, well, no record company's going to give you this material. It's a good idea, but we can't see how it's going to work. Yeah. And I said, let me just make a few phone calls. And I called up a friend of mine, Tom Bridgewater at Loose Records, and he was an Americana label. And he said, yeah, have anything you like. It sounds like a great promotion, opportunity. These tracks aren't being played anywhere. You'll never see them on, these bands on TV. Have what you like. I found City Slang in Germany, same response. Very quickly, I cleared all the tracks for it. And that became Uncut's Sounds of the New West Volume 1. And it sold really, really well. Yeah. And after that, we did, I think, 5 other volumes dedicated to Americana. But that kind of music became central to the regular monthly cover-mounted CDs that we started from about 2000, I think. Yeah, and they were a great circulation boost.
I think they were in dual cases as well, weren't they?
People expected them every issue. We couldn't take them off the cover once we started that.
Yeah, I mean, I still buy, if I go into a second-hand shop and I see some Uncut compilations in there, 50 pence or whatever, I'm still buying them, because I know there's going to be something on there I'm going to love, because it's so kind of eclectic.
Yeah, hopefully so. I mean, they're usually a joy to put together, especially the Americana ones, because I particularly like that kind of music. Yeah. but I would hope, that for anybody buying the magazine on a monthly basis, there would always be something, that they would want to buy, the parent album, and hopefully, other albums by that artist once they've been exposed to the first album.
Yeah, and it's quite clever as well. I always thought the way that you get the track listing on the front, and almost invariably most of those artists would crop up in some shape or form in that publication. They might have a new record out, there'll be an interview or something, just tied together really nicely.
Yeah, we would try wherever possible, to tie them in, to the extent that sometimes we would do themed CDs. We did one where we did 4 split covers on the Beatles. So each cover had an individual portrait of the Beatles. And the CD, I think we did compile 17 great cover versions of Beatles tracks.
Yeah.
And it worked really well. We used that as a model further down the line for The Clash, Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, and Bruce Springsteen, I think.
You still write for Uncut now? Because I know you on the weekend you were writing a review for a new Pretenders
occasionally,
album. Yeah.
Occasionally.
Guest write, I suppose.
Is that right? I've just reviewed the new Pretenders album from that's the most recent thing.
Any good?
It's okay. It's of all the albums that Chrissie Hynde recorded, since the first 2 Pretenders albums with the original lineup, it's the one that most urgently seems to want to sound like Pretenders 2 and Pretenders 1. I mean, they could have called it Pretenders 3, and kind of ignored everything that's come in between this album and 1981. It's kind of a bit striving at times.
I mean, Chrissie Hynde, if you think about Chrissie Hynde, even now, I mean, she's kind of she's like iconic figure, in music, and you've met many of those over the years. Can you think of maybe one of your early interviews where you said you used to wake up every day and think, oh, am I really doing this? You must have stepped into a room with someone and, blimey, this is actually happening, What was the first time that kind of happened? Do you remember?
Well, I think it kind of happened virtually every time. As I say, when I first started off, when I was doing the kind of hit parade bands, I didn't quite have that. I mean, it was like a novelty to be suddenly in a room with Gary Glitter or Shawaddy Waddy or the Bay City Rollers. But the first time I was really kind of overawed at the prospect of meeting somebody was Leonard Cohen, who I did I'd been on the paper about 2 months by then. So that was a huge breakthrough. But the most staggering one of all was meeting Lou Reed for the first time. I didn't have time to prepare for that one because I actually just got into the office and Mick Watts called me over and said, I thought quite facetiously, you're a fan of the Velvet Underground, aren't you? And, because I was always banging on about them. And I said, yes, of course I am, that. And he said, great. I want you to interview Lou Reed. And I got immediately excited and thought it might be like the following week or the week after, sometime in the future. And he said, okay, you've got 35 minutes to get around to Barrister Records. He's there being interviewed as we speak. So I just grabbed the cab, sped around there. And there were 2 people in line to interview Lou before me. Both of whom were given very, very short thrift. I think one was in for about 5 minutes and had just been sent packing. And the second was a guy called Giovanni Dodoma, who's a friend of mine who wrote the sounds. And he'd interviewed Lou before and apparently had got on with him. So he strolled in rather casually to interview Lou and came out about 12 minutes later looking very pale. I mean, Lou just apparently destroyed him. Poor Giovanni was near to tears. And at that point, I was shunted in to meet him. And got 27 minutes of the most vivid verbal abuse I've ever experience. And I thought, great, it's Lou Reed. I just
Absolutely.
couldn't believe it.
Yeah, your stories are incredible. I mean, the ones that it didn't even make the book. I mean, there's another book there, but I think you know that if you want to do it.
Yeah.
But that reminds me to some extent. It's not about me; it's about you. But one of my first ever major interviews with radio was to meet John Lydon, who at the time the Pill was sort of the second album, I think it was. And I interviewed him in the basement of a hotel in London, and I know you must have met him many times. I can't remember his tall wife, his name, German lady. You'll know.
Laura.
Yeah. So she was there with him. He comes in with a gold lame coat down to his feet, sort of thing, and he tore into me from the very beginning. Was abusive, rude, in my face, offensive. And he was absolutely everything I wanted him to be.
Absolutely. I mean, if I'd walked into that room and Lou had been sitting in the corner doing a bit of crochet work and having a cup of tea and a digestive biscuit, I would have been mortified.
Yeah.
That he was there in a leather jacket, shades, chain smoking, drinking whiskey, and being as rude as one human being can be to another, was just perfect. And as these insults, just came out in this kind of like apparently ceaseless torrent, I'd had the presence of mind to switch on my tape, and I hoped I was recording it because the interview was writing itself for me.
Yeah.
And so I just stood there, and if he seemed to be, coming to a slight lull, I would say something that would provoke him to continue at greater intensity. And I thought, even if at the end of this he just tells me to leave the room, I've got the makings of a good piece. But as it happened, something I said attracted his attention, softened his attitude, and he said, "Sit down, have a drink." And for the next 2.5 hours, he answered every question I asked in incredible detail, very generous with his answers, incredibly funny, and at a time when he hated virtually every journalist he met. I just hit it off with him. Yeah. And at the end of the interview, he asked me what I was doing the following week. And when I told him that, it depended on where Melody Maker sent me, it could be any deadbeat. He said, "No, forget all about that. I want you to come on tour with me in Sweden." And I just thought, he's got to be joking. But he called in, the Arista press officer, and said, "Alan's coming with me to Sweden next week. I want you to book your flights, make sure we've got the hotel that we're staying at, everything." And I thought, this is not going to happen. When I got back to the office, they were amazed that I seemed to have got an interview with Lou, got him talking. I ran through everything he spoke about. And prior to the interview, I'd actually been taken aside and told that I wasn't to ask Lou about the Velvet Underground. What? Couldn't talk to him about David Bowie. What? Couldn't talk to him about Nico, John Cale, Berlin, Metal Machine Music. If I'd accepted those rules, I might as well have gone off to interview somebody else.
Yes.
I mean, it's Lou Reed. He's central to all these. But when I actually asked Lou about anything, he answered it. There was nothing off limits. But I still didn't think it would happen. But, come the appointed day, a car turned up for me, took me to the airport. I flew to Sweden. There was a car waiting for me in Stockholm, drove me to the hotel, and Lou was waiting in the hotel lobby for me.
And no doubt there was a glass of whiskey or something on the table waiting for you, yeah?
Well, he took me off to meet his dealer, actually. And he went downhill from there.
I mean, in the book, there's one thing, another thing which you cannot fail to notice is like almost every single story, and it's got to be, I don't know how many stories there are in that book, almost every single one will either involve, alcohol or drugs, maybe both.
I was very easily led astray. Well, there were a lot of both around at the time.
Yeah, but it's like, it just, I honestly can't think of a single story in there which one of them is not mentioned. Do you concerned about your lifestyle at any point at all? Or?
I was enjoying myself too much to be that worried, to be honest. I mean, there were a few kind of medical mishaps along the way.
Yes, yes.
But I kept going. Got plenty of fresh air and exercise. It seemed to see me through.
I mean, one of the things you mentioned earlier, which was triggered in my mind as well, like you just said, the story with Lou Reed, and we were talking earlier, and you were saying about the kind of limited kind of windows of, between, the music scene and kind of journalism these days. But the fact you could actually go on tour with these people and spend so much time with these people and socialize and get to know them in a different kind of way, I mean, that's kind of priceless stuff. Is there a particular tour you went on, which, I mean, you did so many, but are there any particular tours which really kind of life-changing almost in the way they kind of affected you?
I'm not sure if it was life-changing, but there was an incredible experience on it. It was the first tour of America that the Clash did, and I flew out to join them in Cleveland, which I think was about 3 dates into the tour, and I was on the road for them for a week. And they had Bo Diddley on the tour as support act. Which hadn't gone down very well with promoters or CBS in America. They really didn't want Bo Diddley, anywhere near the Clash. The Clash were, indignant about that and insisted that he play with them.
Yeah.
And there was a long drive from Cleveland to Washington, D.C. overnight through one of the most terrible blizzards they'd had in that part of the world, in anybody's lifetime. It was really horrendous. And we were driving on through the darkness, and I just couldn't sleep. Most of the Clash had crashed out, because they'd been driving a long while. They were really worn out already, with only 3 dates into the tour. And I was in the main part of the coach with the bunks and stuff in the back of it. And I sat up front with the driver for about an hour, and he turned out to be Waylon Jennings' tour driver, and
Right.
he was actually Waylon Jennings' tour bus that the Clash had hired for their tour.
Yeah.
So for an hour, I was entertained endlessly by these wild stories about Waylon Jennings. It was fantastic. Anyway, I thought I'd better leave him, to concentrate on his driving, because by this time the blizzard was getting worse and worse, and we were veering all over the road. So I just took a seat towards the middle of the coach and was drifting off. And I was kind of aware of somebody taking a seat across the aisle from me, and I heard the top of a bottle being unscrewed, somebody taking a very long, satisfied glug from whatever was in the bottle. And then I felt a tap on the shoulder and kind of opened my eyes and turned around, and it was Bo Diddley offering me the bottle.
Yeah.
And I thought, Bo Diddley? And I said, yeah, sure, I'll have a drink. And it turned out to be some kind of moonshine of his own brew from his own recipe. And it virtually took my head off. And this made, Bo laugh. And we just kept passing the bottle back and forth for about, an hour or so. Bo just telling me stories about being on the road, and talking about Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee.
Wow.
It was just amazing. That was just a magical sort of hour in the middle of this huge snowstorm, somewhere on the road between Cleveland and Washington.
That's just beautiful. I love that. I love that. I love those stories. Like you say, and you, the way you write for people, you're clearly writing for people who love music, so that's why I love your book so much, and the way you write. Did you come across? Firstly, did you record the interview with Bo Diddley, or was it just formal?
For any big sit-down formal interview, I would obviously take a lot of tape recorder.
Yeah.
On the road, I find if you carried a tape recorder around all the time and started talking to people and you switch it on, they'd shut up.
Yeah.
They become much more guarded. So I dispensed with the tape recorder completely, and I found out that I'm frankly blessed with a very retentive memory. I could easily put together conversations. Again, it goes back to the observational thing. I would if I was on the road, I would pretend that I was actually filming it, and break down episodes from the tour as scenes in a movie, almost kind of storyboard it, and remember conversations as dialogue. And it worked. I was able to do that convincingly. And I found whatever state I was in, I found that I had quite detailed recall, amazingly so. I mean, I can remember conversations with Nick Lowe at the bar of Dingwalls at 3 o'clock in the morning, both of us going to rip to hell. And I can remember them really clearly. Often I can't remember what the last thing I watched on television the night before was. But, take me back 45 years and I can create entire scenes, or the events of a tour very, very easily.
I mean, that's quite a skill. Firstly, to be able to drink so much, and secondly, to remember the stories. I mean, it's a great combination,
Yeah, I just found it always worked really well to become part of whatever was happening, just throw myself in as bait.
I was firstly, Tony. My time is running out on here. Are you able to save me on that? Yeah, great.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay. We're recording.
I mean, this is just beautiful stuff for Keep Cardiff Live. I'm thinking about Tony actually, because Keep Cardiff Live, just to tell you, Alan, it's based, obviously it's about Cardiff, it's about music, and we've both played together in bands for like years and whatever. I'm wondering if Tony's picking up with some ideas here without for how you could utilize some of these kind of approaches, I suppose, to make Keep Cardiff Live interesting, because there's some some great ideas in there. When you have a look at Keep Cardiff Live, Alan, maybe if you wanted to just respond and just tell us what you think about the site would be nice, because maybe you'll hate it, I don't know, but but talking about things that you don't like, I've probably interviewed about a 20th, if that, of the people you've interviewed. I've only come across 2 acts with which I didn't get on. Okay, one of them was the early days of Blur at the time of There's No Other Way, when Damon and the other guy, I don't know, I think he's a chef or something, it came in, and they were really totally pretentious middle-class wazzocks, really difficult to deal with. It was quite painful. And the only other one, which really surprises me and disappoints me really, was I managed to fall out with Neil Finn, Crowded House, when they came in. Because,
really?
mostly because the band that he were with were a bit weird to me, but I also asked the wrong questions, probably. But looking at your book, there's 3 figures that spring to mind with which you seem to have slightly more maybe, I wouldn't use the word disregard, maybe don't come across that well in your book, shall we say. One of which is Brian Ferry, the other one is Sting, and the third one, which quite surprised me, is Elvis Costello. So I don't know whether you want to say anything about any of those figures and your experiences with them.
Well, Elvis, I think there's a chapter that I didn't put in the book, which I retrospectively wish I had, which corrects the impression of Elvis as he appears in the stories that are in the book. Costello, like a lot of people, when he first came on the scene in 1977, just wanted to make an impression. And one of the impressions that he made was somebody who was completely outspoken. He came across as very arrogant, but he just had some. I can see how people, would read the pieces in the book and think serially that Elvis was just incredibly arrogant, incredibly rude. He just had just tremendous self-belief, and he was playing a role that Dylan had performed earlier. There's a couple of incidents which were just straight out of Don't Look Back. The really acerbic, opinionated rock star with nothing but disdain for the people he thinks don't understand him properly. Elvis had been very, very frustrated, and when he'd been turned down by so many labels who hadn't given him a chance, didn't really listen to his demos or his live renditions of the songs he'd written when he'd march into somebody's office. A lot of frustration had built up over the years, and it became a profitable source for songs about rejection, about antagonism in relationships and with the music business, whatever. And he just played out a kind of role at that time. I don't think he needed much encouragement. And, he was very, very shaped by Jake Riviera, who thought that provocation and confrontation equaled, quite a lot of coverage in the music press. If Elvis had an acerbic opinion about anything. He would grab a couple of headlines. Berry, I really liked. He was very narcissistic, but at the same time, he's a brilliant songwriter, singer, arranger, made incredible records with Roxy Music and some of his solo albums also. But he always struck me as being, I don't know, he wasn't self-effacing. He seemed to lack some inner confidence in a lot of ways. He was very uncertain, and I remember being in the studio when they were supposed to be mixing the final tracks for his solo album, In Your Mind, and he was still writing lyrics. He was still going over tracks. It was as if he didn't feel confident enough that they were actually finished. It was always seeking to make some small adjustment, some small enhancement that would make it even more perfect than it already was. Latterly his social climbing, became more and more kind of visibly obnoxious, and it was inherent in conversations I had with him then. He didn't. He didn't like to mix with other musicians to the extent that you'd find him at a club, like Dingwall's or a Speakeasy. He'd be down tramps or Arabellas with minor, members of the aristocracy.
Yes.
He thought that was more his grooving scene.
Yeah,
Sting, on the other hand, was obnoxious from the start.
Right. I was going to say, as we move on to Sting, is it with Sting, one of the things that comes across to me with Sting, I might be completely wrong, is a kind of a pretentiousness and of a being from another class kind of thing, and leaving his kind of roots behind him. Grew up in not that sort of grandiose part of Newcastle. Is there something there with him and Ferry in that kind of way or not?
Well, I was just going to say, there is that comparison. Ferry didn't so much deny his past as thought it irrelevant. Sting did two things. He kind of played up the working class background and at the same time aspired to a kind of patrician distance from it. But mostly he was just obsessed with himself. There was Sting, and the rest of the world was a mirror in which he saw his reflection, really. He could be very funny at times, but eventually he was just wearing. He looked at the world and he seemed to think, how can I make money out of you?
Okay. Yeah, interesting. So were there people that you, I suppose he must be one of them, I don't know, maybe not actually. Were there people who you met who you built up an expectation of who didn't meet your expectations in a disappointing way, maybe no expectations of Sting, I don't know.
I'm not sure. Some people just didn't turn out to be who, what I thought they might be like. There was nobody that I had high expectations of that actually disappointed me. When I think of people like, Bowie, say, or Van Morrison, Lou especially, Costello, Nick Lowe. Now, they were all, they all lived up to everything I hoped of them. As I say, the oddest people I met were, who turned out to be very, very different, would be somebody like Gordon Lightfoot, who I'd always cast as a pretty, inoffensive singer-songwriter, crafted some, decently lovely songs. But he turned out to be, just about the single most obnoxious person that I met in my career interviewing people.
So, Alan, another question I wanted to ask you, which is, I suppose, a different kind of question, really. But you've interviewed so many people, but are there some people that you never quite managed to, hook up with? Is anyone sort of you wish you'd had the chance to interview?
Well, there are quite a few dead people who I never got the chance to do. I would have loved to have interviewed Graham Parsons. He's such a hero of mine. Such an influential musical figure in a lot of them, in terms of a lot of the music I've ended up listening to. He seemed to have a hand in inspiring or shaping. of people living. I never did Keith Richards, which would have been a guess,
Right.
I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I absolutely. You've obviously read the book, I guess. I think Life, Keith Richards' book. Have you read it? I don't know. Maybe it's a fantastic book. Anyway, I absolutely loved it. And he goes on about guitar tunings and stuff, which is close to mine and Tony's heart. And
Yeah.
you know, and he says how he got those stone sounds on the chords, and if we
Oh,
try and
yeah.
play it conventionally, you just can't get those sounds. But he comes across as a really kind of. He comes across really well in the book. I imagine he'd have been a great one to talk to. I'm not so sure.
Oh, I would imagine it'd just be totally
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. I don't know
And
what.
So I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say about Jagger. Did you meet Jagger?
No.
Okay.
I mean, he would have been fascinating as well, but, you know, like all Stones fans, you know, we all love Keith, really.
Yes, yes. Yeah. There's something about Keith. I don't know what it is, but I mean, when he did the stuff with Chuck Berry, and he's playing this relatively simple kind of rock and roll stuff, and Chuck Berry is giving him the old, you know, giving him a going over. No, mate, it's not like that. It's like this, you know. It's just lovely to see him, you know, his love of music coming through in that.
Well,
you know?
I think whenever you see Keith being interviewed and being interviewed well,
Yeah.
his love of music and the people he's made music with, you know, just comes over so overwhelmingly. And, you know, he's just one of those people who just kind of, you know, breathes music, you know, and I'm sure it'd be, you know, an incredible pleasure and very exciting just to, you know, breathe the air around him.
Yes. Tony Chapman is still with us, and I don't know, Alan. You haven't, obviously you've not seen the site yet, but if you had a site which was called Keep Cardiff Live, and it was all sort of about music, predominantly about music and the history of music in Cardiff, but also looking to the future to a certain extent. And because we talked about earlier how things have changed over the years, it's almost like an online magazine site, I suppose.
Yeah.
So without giving any trade secrets away, I wonder if you'd have any tips for Tony in what would make an interesting site of that type to you, perhaps. If you were running that site, what would you do with it, do you think?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm sure there are loads of local musicians out there that maybe a lot of people haven't heard of. But I'm sure they've got, between them, amazing stories. And that's the kind of thing that interests me is people's stories, really.
Yeah.
Anything that illuminates and highlights that, I'm in like a shot. And,
So,
you know, what are people listening to? What are their favourite records? What are the records that, you know, shape their musical tastes? People talking about the music that they like. It invariably attracts and interests me.
Yeah, I feel the same about it. And I used to work in a music shop, and what got me interested in doing this site in the first place was people would come in to buy a set of strings or whatever, and you get chatting to them, and it was all so casual that they would come out with these great stories about, oh, well, I remember I was on the road and this happened and that happened, and I met so and so, and did you, you know? And it was almost like I was doing an interview in the music shop because I was so passionate and interested in it.
Yeah.
And I thought afterwards, I'm sure a lot of people would be interested in these stories. So I talked to a friend, and he suggested doing this website. And to me, it was like yourself. It was always about the stories. It wasn't about anything else. You get people talking, and these stories come out, and they're amazing. They're magical.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that's the passion behind the site, and that's why we like doing it. Steve and myself enjoy it. You know, we're both passionate about music, and we just love the stories that people come up with. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, basically, that's the same approach that I had to, you know, Melody Maker when I was editor, and even more so on Uncut. You know, we were driven, you know, purely by our enthusiasms. When Uncut launched, it didn't immediately get a really good readership, and circulation wasn't so high, and we struggled for a year or so because of the, as much as anything, because of the split editorial. At first it was almost 50-50, almost 50-50 split between music and movies, and that seemed to confuse people. You know, was it a music magazine, a film magazine? And, you know, I'd say, well, it's basically a magazine about your interests. You know, if you're into music, invariably you're into a certain kind of films, all kinds of compatibilities.
Yeah.
But it was all driven by just our sheer enthusiasm. If it hadn't been for our enthusiasm, we would have felt that we were, you know, really struggling. But I just felt confident that if we could get a certain balance right, distribution was right, we would find a readership. And eventually we did after 2 or 3 years. Because I just knew, and I was convinced that my enthusiasms weren't that very different from the enthusiasms of people, you know, around my age, you know, hopefully younger as well. But what I think bound Uncut to its readers was, you know, just a mutual love of music in all its forms, and this endless fascination and appetite for great stories about music.
Yes, yeah.
About the
I don't think
music
that's gone
itself
away, is it?
and the people who made it.
Yeah, I mean, that never goes away, I don't think, does it, Alan?
Oh no, it hasn't for me anyway. And,
No.
and you know, lots of people my age. You know, I remember, you know, going back many years when I first got into music. You know, I'm sure, you know, my parents or whatever thought it would be a passing fad, and it was expected really that you'd be in music up to a certain age, then you get married, then you'd have kids, then you'd have a mortgage, and you know, music and going to gigs was something that you did in a previous life. But you know, my previous life is the life I'm leading now. You know, there hasn't been much of a separation.
46
I mean,
years
I can still
or
get
so.
excited about an album as much now as I did when I was 16.
Do you still buy albums?
Yeah. Since I retired, I've kind of basically had to. I mean, I was in a very fortunate position for many years of getting everything for nothing and totally spoiled. But I enjoy buying. Yes, I just bought the new Laura Marling album, the new Lucinda Williams album.
Yeah. Lucinda Williams, I mean, obviously that's taking you towards a kind of, you know, big tinge of Americana, I suppose, and that, but with a bit of an edge, you know, with Lucinda Williams, isn't there? But the songwriting there and the storytelling is kind of what Lucinda Williams is about. Would you say the storytelling?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, going back to a very first Rough Trade album, but especially on probably my favorite Lucinda album, Car Wheels on a Gravel Road. I mean, that's an autobiography. And her father was a writer, and she's obviously inherited a lot of her kind of literary techniques. She's one of those songwriters, you know, you could imagine, you know, those songs being movies, you could imagine them being short stories, the basis of novels. They've all got, well, the lyrics, obviously, I'm talking about, you know, all have an incredible literary quality, which she shares with writers like Townes Van Zandt or Guy Clark. You know, Guy is just an amazing example of a storyteller as much as a songwriter. And I just love that. And you get it especially in what we call Americana or country music. Yeah,
which is obviously, I don't know, I mean, maybe that's why that is your particular kind of most favorite territory, it appears. And I'm guessing it's because of that kind of storytelling paradigm that it all sits on. I mean, even people like Springsteen, he's a fantastic storyteller, you know. But I know you're a massive Dylan fan. I get the impression you're a massive Dylan fan. Chronicles is one of my favorite ever books. It's just absolutely amazing read, and you can hear Dylan's voice, you know, when you're reading that book. And he did the radio stuff; he was brilliant at that. Tell us a bit about Dylan and what makes him so special to you.
Well, my history with Dylan is a bit more complicated than it might sound. When I first started getting into music and buying records, Dylan already seemed to belong to an older crowd. And part of the excitement of getting into music for the first time was finding out things that were new and unique and personal to you. And Dylan seemed to be already shared out, and I associated him with a kind of a slightly older set of friends who were incredibly serious about Dylan. I mean, oh God, I used to be browbeaten by him. And he was like being prescribed a foul-tasting medicine. Listen to Dylan, it'll do you good. And I immediately, you know, reacted against that. You know, I was much more into Lou Reed or, you know, Love or Pink Floyd, Hendrix, the Stones still. So I did like Dylan, and somebody gave me as a present John Wesley Harding, and in the first 2 weeks I had that, I played it to death. I mean, the vinyl was melting by the end. I loved it, but I wasn't what you might call a huge Dylan fan. I'd get some of the records and I'd really like them. I loved Highway 61, but it wasn't until much later that I really, really got into Dylan. It was actually when I got married, and my wife and we moved in together. Prior to actually getting married, my girlfriend, as she was then, was appalled that I didn't have a lot of Dylan albums. And in fact, I'd lost loads because I'd previously lived in a squat and moved out, left my record collection there, went back and found half of it gone. And whoever stole the records had incredibly good taste, because it was a lot of Van Morrison, Little Feat, Dylan. And anyway, so I didn't have much Dylan. There were a couple of albums. And she went out one afternoon, said she'd be back later, and about 2 hours later I had a cab driving up outside the house, and she'd been down to the local Smiths and bought their entire catalogue of Bob Dylan albums. It took the cab driver two trips to get them all in the house.
I bet.
So I started listening to them, and the albums that I really picked up on, coming in very late, were the religious albums, so-called, which I thought were fantastic. And of course they were, Dylan's most unpopular works to date in a way. Especially amongst critics, but I was besotted by them, and I started liking a lot. And this was at a time, sort of mid to late 80s, where Dylan had virtually been written off by everybody. His career was, pretty much in the doldrums. His critical reputation was, an all-time low. And this is the moment I decided to, get right into Bob. And I remember going to see him for the first time at Wembley Arena, or the Empire Pool as it was then. I was on a tour with Tom Petty, and it was the Temple in Flames tour. It was the last tour he did before he launched the Never Ending tour, which kind of eventually revived his career and his critical standing. And I thought it was an astonishing show. I remember just before he came on, I went to get some beers, and I was coming back into the arena, just got at the top of the stairs. I could see the stage, and I had 2 pints of beer in my hands, and Tom Petty was already on with the band, and they were obviously going to launch into something as the opening number of Dylan's set. And with that, Dylan walked on stage. He looked like an Apache Indian who just kind of, escaped from the reservation. He had this bandana around his head, motorcycle jacket, billowing white shirt, his sash around his waist, leather trousers, biker boots, and gloves. The first time I'd seen anybody playing guitar with gloves. And he walked straight to the microphone stand and launched, much to Tom Petty's surprise, into Like a Rolling Stone, which on the tour had always been the last number they played. He decided that number that night to open with it and not tell anybody. So the band all jumped to attention. It was like all hands on deck as they could have gone, right, I mean, this is what we're playing now. And I remember just thinking, it's great. And he went through, it was... the set was full of, very familiar, old favorites, but it was like an act of artistic vandalization. He had to destroy these songs to remake them. I just thought it was absolutely fantastic. But I remember John Peel was sitting behind, and he kept tapping me on the shoulder going, this is absolute rubbish. How could anybody so great descend to lows like this? And I was going, John, man, it's fantastic. And he said, no. This is absolutely the most dreadful thing. And John Peel wrote a review of it for The Observer that weekend, which said it is, Dylan is now over for everybody, surely. It has no relevance. He's saying nothing new. He's just, destroying all his old music. And I thought, yes, this is the point. He's got to do this. He's got to, hence the name of the tour, Temples in Flames. He was destroying his past to recreate it anew. And it was a long and often painful process. But watching that story, that new narrative unfold, has just endlessly fascinated me since those concerts. There's nobody whose music continues to affect me so greatly. Maybe Lou, a lot of Van, Grant Parsons for sure, but Dylan above anybody. It's just such a remarkable story, and his third act renaissance, following Time Out of Mind has been just incredible. I keep going to see him because I know one show is going to be so different from the next.
Yeah.
You know, there's an old saying that Dylan never plays the same song twice. He never plays the same song once, you know, in the same way. It's just incredible, the nuances, the differences he can find. I went on the opening dates of his 2006 Modern Times tour. I followed him down from Vancouver to Portland, Seattle, and then to San Francisco. I saw, I think, maybe 6 shows in 7 or 8 days, and they were all completely different. I mean, sometimes the difference was nuance. There'd be slight rearrangements, but from night to night, you might decide to do completely different versions of, you know, of tracks, and he was just extraordinary.
And again,
I mean, nobody exerts such a powerful command of my attention.
And he probably wouldn't tell the bands if he was changing things.
I'm sorry?
He probably wouldn't change the band if he was changing things. He'd just do it, I guess.
Oh yes, I mean, if you look at any kind of video clips of Dylan playing with musicians, all the eyes are on him. You know, they don't know where he's going to go. Yeah. We interviewed Ben Montench from the Heartbreakers about the times the Heartbreakers had toured with Dylan. He said night after night that they never knew quite where he was going to go. So he said, you know, you have to keep watching him. And if you see, even now, Donny Heron, who plays pedal steel, banjo and fiddle, he's always just slightly behind Dylan. And if any of the clips you watch, he just never takes his eyes off Bob.
Yeah.
You know, what he's going to play next, you know, what tempo a song is going to be in. I think, you know, over the last few years, you think things are going to settle down somewhat. But the last time he played Hyde Park last summer, less than a year ago, he'd been doing an established set throughout the tour until that date, but he just changed it all around. I mean, some of the arrangements of songs were just incredible. There was a version of Like a Rolling Stone, which over the last 10 years or so has become, you know, quite a bit of a sing-along, and rather quite predictable. You know, it's roughly the same version with a few minor details and adjustments, but it had been given a complete makeover. It was like a stacked single from B-side from about 1965. I mean, it was just extraordinary. I was open mouthed watching it. You know, there were even some like, you know, justifying soul declamations and stuff in it. You know, tell me one more time. It was just extraordinary.
I noticed recently you've been sharing a few video clips of Dylan at various kind of stages of his career, I suppose. And the thing you seem to be picking up on, I suppose, in some ways, it's like I picked up on your book. It's got a lovely sense of nihilism and sort of self-destruction which runs through it, you know. And you pick up on that kind of emotional angst that is within Dylan that comes out, don't you?
Oh, well, it's not hard to find, you know, on a lot of those clips. And I started putting them up because I just spent ages on YouTube going from one thing to another. And, you know, even without, you know, searching too hard, these absolute gems of performances keep cropping up. And it's always a reminder, you know, it drives me mad when people keep asking the question, why does Dylan keep doing this? As if he should have retired, you know, but he's a singer, he's a songwriter, he's a performer. This is what he does. And he keeps doing it. And why not? You know, it's ridiculous. You know, if filmmakers making movies into their 80s and beyond, nobody tells an author that they've got to stop writing novels when they're at a certain age. You know, they carry on and, you know, they write until, you know, they can't write no more. And
do they tell you that, Allan?
And you can just see from a lot of these clips, you know, it's just this colossal enthusiasm and amazement at the noise he's making sometimes. It's just infectious.
Do people tell you, Allan, you shouldn't be writing these days, you're too old to write that stuff? Do they say that to you?
Fortunately, no.
Good.
No, I haven't had that yet.
Good. Well,
it might yet come. Sometimes I feel like I'm, you know, a bit too old and out of touch. But it usually passes.
I mean, you're a walking fund of rock and roll tales, you know, so you know, that's the beauty of what you bring to the table. Maybe you don't recognize it in yourself that way, but you know, you've got that fund of amazing tales, which is just a great. I mean, sure, you know, we both love hearing you talk about it.
Yeah.
Did you ever get to interview Dylan? Then I guess you did a few times.
No,
No.
no. I think we may have had one interview in Melody Maker that wasn't sort of bought in. There was never a chance, never an opportunity for Uncut to interview Dylan. I did buy in once a very good interview from Australia. A writer called Murray Engelhurt had got in touch with me. Thought we might be interested. And Dylan was doing an Australian tour. I think it must have been the first time he played there for years. And to help sell tickets, he agreed to do a couple of press interviews, and Murray got one. And the paper that he worked for, you know, took what they needed, which wasn't very much, and we gladly scooped up the rest. I must say, I kind of, whenever Dylan did release anything new, and you know there was, you know, perhaps an opportunity that for once he might do an interview, I lived in fear. I mean, you go into, where would you start with Dylan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I wouldn't have a clue. I mean, blimey, that'd be almost.
I mean, he'd be the person I'd be most nervous about doing.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to ask you one kind of final thing, Willie. I don't know how you're going to respond to this, but I mean, we're in a situation now where we get this kind of COVID-19 thing going on. There's no live music going on. Bands are kind of struggling to survive, etc. We talked earlier about the kind of disappearance of the physical nature of music. You know, we used to buy an album, you look at the sleeve, you buy the sleeve notes. It was a whole package. You know, things have changed so much. What kind of future in this kind of Spotify streaming world, and non-music magazine, non-print press almost world? What kind of music is there, do you see, for music, you know?
For music generally, I have no idea. I mean, a lot of the bands that I like currently make their livings by playing small venues. And I fear, you know, that some of those small venues in the UK won't be there when this wretched virus thing is over. And so, you know, where are those bands going to make any money? You know, they're not the kind of bands that could survive on record sales alone. You know, they need to tour. They love touring. People like going to see them, if not in huge stadium filling numbers. That's my greatest concern, is that, you know, what exists still of, you know, the gig circuit as it was before the pandemic, you know, how much of it is going to survive? You know, I'd be very, very worried, you know, for, you know, smaller promoters who putting together tours in you know, small or medium-sized venues, or the smaller boutique festivals, you know, especially the Roots kind of festivals. Are they going to be able to, you know, return? It must be incredibly worrying for, you know, a lot of bands, the smaller labels. The record shops aren't open. How much are they selling online? I don't know.
Yeah,
but you know, there'll always be a band. You know, as Dave Edmonds used to say, there'll always be a bunch of snotty kids wanting to make a record on guitars. You know, even into the back room of a pub, or you know, the mum's front room, or a basement somewhere. And you just hope there'll be some way that, you know, eventually that'll be heard.
Yeah, there's a good old Cardiff boy for you. Who's also a bit of a character, as it comes across.
Dave was, you know, just about one of the nicest people I ever met. He's a great, generous, courteous, you know, very funny guy, and a great guitarist and great singer and producer. And he was in one of my favorite groups of all time, which was Rockpile.
I just want to ask you one more question, because you've given us so much time, and we thank you very much. It's just been great to hear.
No, it's my pleasure.
Stories. Now you keep on putting out these stories that didn't make the first book, yeah, and
yeah.
You know, so what's the chances of the second book?
Well, as you probably recognise, the material's there, but there aren't complications. The first book was, in a way, quite expensive to put out, for the publishers at least, because it was all drawn on material that originally appeared either in Uncut or Melody Maker. I didn't have copyright on it as a staff member for all those years of, first of all, IPC, then Time Warner, and whoever owns Uncut now, and owns retrospectively the Melody Maker archive. I had to pay them to, I had to license the material for the book. And as Bloomsbury, the publishers, kept asking for more stories above the original agreed word count, obviously the cost per story of licensing then went up. So basically, my entire advance for the book, which was increased from the original agreed amount they were going to pay me, it all went anyway to Time Warner at the time. I had to pay for my own, for the privilege of publishing, rewritten versions of stuff that I'd already written. So I'm not sure how easy it would be to get the same sort of material from the current owners of Uncut, if they have any sense of how well the first book did, which, it wasn't an international bestseller, but it did very well. And if I hadn't had to pay all the licensing fees, I would have made quite a bit of money out of it. But I didn't do the book just to make money. I'm lucky enough I didn't need to do it for those reasons. But I think it was a bit off-putting for the publishers in the end. There were some hair-raising moments just as the book was going to go to be printed, where the syndication department that I was dealing with decided to revise the original agreement, and it looked like they were going to have to pull the book at one point. And I think the editor at Bloomsbury got a bit frustrated. I don't think they'd be interested, but since I've been running the online series of stories on my Facebook page, there has been interest from a couple of other publishers. So perhaps there may be a second volume in some form.
Well, funny enough, we're coming towards the close of the interview now, but I know for technical reasons we're talking to you via your Kindle. So I hope that people still buy books.
Oh, yeah, but it's available as an audiobook and also as a Kindle version of it.
Well, listen, Alan, thank you so much for talking to us today. I've absolutely loved it, and I without embarrassing you, I absolutely love the book, and it was just great for me to be able to contact the writer of a book I've just loved reading, and then talk to them. So
that's very flattering. Thank you very much.
And I hope you enjoy that. When we load it up on Keep Cardiff Live, and have a look, and come back and write a scathing review or whatever you want to do. Really,
I will do.
I'm sure you will. But thank you, Alan.
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you very much,
Alan.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you both.